May 15, 1946. In the small Bavarian town of Mittenwald, nestled beneath the towering Alps, 17-year-old Elsa Weber sat at her weathered desk, carefully addressing an envelope by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. Germany lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its economy shattered, and its people hungry. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a simple letter of gratitude to an American soldier who had shown kindness to her family would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything Elsa believed about her former enemies and transform not only her life, but the lives of dozens of families on both sides of the Atlantic. The morning light filtered through the threadbare curtains of the Weber family home, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. Elsa sealed her letter with careful precision, reviewing the address one final time. Private First Class James Miller, 3rd Infantry Division, APO 987, United States Army. She had memorized the information from the chocolate bar wrapper he had given to her younger brother, Carl, 3 months earlier. The American soldier had been billeted in their neighborhood briefly during the occupation and had shown unexpected kindness to the local children, particularly 8-year-old Carl, who suffered from asthma. Elsa tucked a loose strand of her blonde hair behind her ear and sighed deeply, contemplating whether sending the letter was wise. Relations between occupiers and occupied remained tense, despite official policies of reconciliation. Many Germans, including her own father, Werner Weber, maintained a dignified silence around the American soldiers, neither hostile nor friendly. The letter itself was simple enough, a polite expression of gratitude for the medicine the soldier had somehow procured for Carl during a particularly bad asthma attack in February. The American military doctors had access to treatments unavailable to German civilians, especially those without connections to the new authorities. Carl had improved dramatically since then, and her mother had insisted that proper thanks were in order, regardless of political circumstances. What Elsa did not know as she walked to the postal collection point was that her carefully copied address contained a critical error. A smudge on the chocolate wrapper had caused her to misread a single digit in the Army post office number. Her letter would never reach Private First Class James Miller of the 3rd Infantry Division. Instead, it would find its way into the hands of Staff Sergeant Robert Anderson of the 97th Infantry Division, a man with a very different background and temperament than the soldier who had helped her brother. Sergeant Robert Anderson, 24 years old, from Millfield, Ohio, sat on his bunk in the converted schoolhouse that now served as American military quarters in Munich. Around him, fellow soldiers played cards, wrote letters home, or napped during their precious downtime. Anderson was sorting through the mail that had just been delivered, surprised to find an envelope addressed in unfamiliar handwriting among his usual letters from his parents and his girlfriend, Patricia. The thin envelope bore German postage and had clearly been examined by military censors before reaching him. His curiosity piqued. Anderson carefully opened it, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was neat and precise, the English imperfect but entirely understandable. Anderson read with increasing confusion. The letter thanked him profusely for medicine he had never provided, for kindness to a boy he had never met, in a town he had never visited. He recognized immediately that the letter had reached him by mistake, but something about the simple, heartfelt gratitude expressed by this German girl named Elsa Weber touched him unexpectedly. His platoon leader, Lieutenant Howard Davis, walked past and noticed the perplexed expression on Anderson's face. Lieutenant Davis paused, adjusting his uniform cap. "Something wrong with your mail, Anderson?" Anderson looked up, still holding the letter. "No, sir. Just got a letter meant for someone else. Some German girl thanking me for helping her little brother. Must have copied the address wrong." Davis shrugged. "Just toss it then. Not your problem." "Yes, sir," Anderson replied automatically, but he found himself carefully refolding the letter and placing it in his pocket rather than the waste bin. Robert Anderson had been raised in a small coal mining community in southeastern Ohio, the son of a mine foreman and a schoolteacher. His father had served in the Great War and had returned with a profound distrust of Germans that he had passed on to his son. When America entered the current conflict, Anderson had enlisted immediately following the events at Pearl Harbor, driven by patriotism and a desire to escape the seemingly inevitable future in the mines. His war experience had been typical of many American soldiers: training in Kentucky, deployment to England, fighting across France following D-Day, and finally into Germany itself. He had seen combat, but had been fortunate enough to avoid the worst of the fighting. What had affected him most deeply was not the battle, but what came after: the discovery of concentration camps, the sight of emaciated survivors, the evidence of atrocities that haunted his dreams. Anderson had developed a complicated relationship with the German people during the occupation. He followed orders and maintained professional distance, but he found it difficult to reconcile the ordinary citizens he encountered: old men sweeping debris from doorsteps, women queuing for rations, children playing in rubble, with the regime that had caused such immense suffering. That evening, after his duties were complete, Anderson found himself rereading the letter from Elsa Weber. Something about her simple expression of gratitude for a small kindness resonated with him. He thought about the medicine she mentioned, picturing a sick child receiving help from a foreign soldier. It represented something he wanted to believe was possible, that even in the aftermath of such a devastating conflict, human connections could form across the divisions of nationality and history. After some deliberation, Anderson made a decision. He would write back, explaining the mistake but acknowledging her gratitude. Perhaps it was a small gesture toward the reconciliation that military government officials spoke of in their briefings, or perhaps it was simply that receiving a personal letter, even one meant for someone else, was a welcome break from the monotony of occupation duty. His reply was brief and formal. "Dear Miss Weber, I received your letter dated May 15, but I believe it was meant for another soldier. I am Staff Sergeant Robert Anderson of the 97th Infantry Division, not Private First Class Miller of the 3rd Infantry. I have never been stationed in Mittenwald and did not provide medicine for your brother. However, I am glad to hear that an American soldier was able to help your family and that your brother is doing better. Please do not trouble yourself about the mistake. Respectfully, Staff Sergeant Robert Anderson." Anderson mailed the letter the following day, expecting that to be the end of the matter. He could not have anticipated how this simple correction would develop into a correspondence that would challenge his preconceptions and eventually affect the lives of dozens of families across 2 continents. 3 weeks passed before Elsa Weber received the response from America. The unfamiliar name and unit designation on the envelope initially confused her, but understanding dawned as she read the brief message. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment at her error. The medicine that had helped Carl so dramatically had come from a complete stranger, and now her thank you note had gone to yet another stranger. The whole situation made her feel foolish and naive. Her father noticed her distress during the family dinner that evening, a meager meal of potato soup and dark bread. Werner Weber, once a mathematics professor at the University of Munich before being dismissed for his lukewarm response to party ideology in 1938, had since supported his family by tutoring and occasional translation work. Werner observed his daughter's unusual quietness. "Is something troubling you, Elsa?" She hesitated before responding, uncertain how her father would react to her correspondence with an American soldier. "I received a reply to my thank you letter today. It seems I sent it to the wrong person. The address on the chocolate wrapper must have been incorrect." Her mother, Margaret, looked up from helping Carl with his soup. "The letter to the American who brought the medicine. What did the reply say?" Elsa explained the situation, producing the letter from her pocket. Her father's expression remained neutral as he examined the neat, straightforward handwriting of Sergeant Anderson. Werner Weber had once been an enthusiastic supporter of the new government that rose to power when Elsa was just a small child. The promises of restored German pride and economic recovery had appealed to him, as they had to millions of others. But as the years passed and the regime's true nature revealed itself, Werner had grown disillusioned. He had never openly opposed the government. He had a family to protect, after all, but he had quietly distanced himself from party activities. The war's end had left him, like many Germans, struggling to reconcile his initial support with the horrific realities that had emerged. After reading the letter, Werner handed it back to Elsa without comment. The silence stretched uncomfortably until he finally spoke. It was polite of him to respond. Most would have simply discarded a misdirected letter. The comment, mild as it was, constituted approval in Werner's restrained manner of expression. Elsa felt a wave of relief. Should I write back thanking him for telling me of my mistake? Her mother interjected before Werner could respond. Of course you should. Basic courtesy demands it. And so Elsa composed a second letter, this one addressed correctly to Staff Sergeant Robert Anderson. She apologized for her error, explained the circumstances more fully, and expressed gratitude for his understanding. She debated whether to include more personal details, but ultimately decided on a formal tone that mirrored his own. She ended with a polite inquiry about his hometown, a small gesture of interest that seemed appropriate, given the unusual circumstances of their correspondence. 2 weeks later, to her surprise, another letter arrived from Sergeant Anderson. This one was longer than the first, still formal but with a warmer tone. He described his hometown in Ohio, mentioned his work overseeing supply distribution in Munich, and asked about her family's well-being, given the difficult conditions in post-war Germany. The letter concluded with a surprising offer. If her brother still needed medication, Anderson might be able to help through official channels, as there were programs being established for civilian medical assistance. This unexpected kindness from a stranger, an American soldier no less, left Elsa deeply conflicted. Throughout her adolescence, she had absorbed the official view of Americans as decadent, materialistic enemies. The defeat and occupation had transformed this abstract enemy into a very real presence in German daily life. While she had never fully embraced the more extreme propaganda, she had accepted the general framework of us versus them that defined the war years. Yet here was this American, Staff Sergeant Robert Anderson from a small mining town in Ohio, offering help to a family he had never met, solely because their paths had crossed through a misdirected letter. It contradicted everything she had been led to believe. That evening, Elsa discussed the situation with her parents. Karl listened intently from his small bed in the corner of their living room, his eyes wide with interest. Werner Weber adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, considering the matter carefully. The Americans have resources we lack. If this sergeant can arrange proper medicine through official channels, it would be foolish to refuse out of pride. Margaret nodded in agreement. Karl's health must come first. Politics aside, the boy needs proper treatment. And so began a correspondence that would span months, gradually evolving from formal exchanges about medicine and official assistance programs to more personal discussions of daily life, hopes, and even cautious reflections on the war that had so recently concluded. Through these letters, Elsa learned that Robert Anderson had studied engineering for 2 years before enlisting, that he had a younger sister named Dorothy who worked as a telephone operator, and that he had no desire to return to the coal mining community where he had been raised. For his part, Anderson discovered that Elsa hoped to become a translator, that her family had lost their home in Munich to bombing and relocated to her grandparents' house in Mittenwald, and that her father had once been respected in academic circles before the political climate changed. By October 1946, their exchange of letters had become a meaningful connection across the divide of recent conflict. In one particularly significant letter, Anderson described his reaction to being assigned to document conditions at a recently liberated concentration camp. He wrote of his shock, his struggle to comprehend the suffering he witnessed, and his difficulty reconciling these discoveries with the ordinary Germans he now encountered daily. Elsa received this letter on a crisp autumn morning. She read it twice while sitting on a bench near the town's small church, the distant mountains capped with the first snow of the season. Anderson's words forced her to confront questions she had been avoiding since the war's end. How much had ordinary Germans known? How much had her own family known or suspected? What responsibility did they bear for the atrocities committed in their name? That evening she composed her most honest letter yet. She wrote of the gradual way information had been controlled, of the fear that prevented questions, of the focus on daily survival as conditions worsened. She described her own journey from acceptance of what she was told to growing doubt, and finally, to the shame that came with Allied revelations at the war's end. "We lived in a world of whispers," she wrote. "Information came in fragments, rumors one feared to repeat, We learned not to ask certain questions. Perhaps that itself was a kind of complicity. I do not offer this as an excuse, only as my experience. At 17, I'm still trying to understand the country I grew up in and my place within its history. When Anderson received this letter, he shared it with his friend and fellow soldier, Corporal Michael Levine, whose Jewish parents had fled Germany in 1935. Levine read it carefully, his expression unreadable. "What do you think?" Anderson asked. "Is she being honest?" Levine handed the letter back. "Maybe. She's young, probably telling the truth as she sees it. My parents would say she and her family should have known more, done more, but—" He paused, considering. "Not everyone could get out like my family did. Not everyone saw what was happening clearly enough to try." Their conversation was interrupted by their commanding officer announcing new deployments. Several units, including Anderson's, would be relocated to Berlin within the month to support operations in the divided capital. The increasing tensions with Soviet forces had shifted American military priorities, and experienced personnel were needed to navigate the complex situation in the divided city. Anderson realized this move would complicate his correspondence with Elsa. Mail between occupation zones could be unreliable, and his new duties would likely leave less time for letter writing. That evening, he composed a letter explaining the situation and providing his new contact information. On impulse, he included a small package, coffee, chocolate, and most importantly, a 3-month supply of asthma medication for Karl, obtained through the civilian assistance program he had mentioned in his earlier letters. In Mittenwald, the Weber family gathered around their table as Elsa opened Anderson's package. Karl's eyes widened at the sight of the medicine that would make his breathing easier through the approaching winter months. Werner Weber held one of the medication boxes, examining the label with a mixture of gratitude and lingering pride that made accepting such help difficult. Margarete Weber, more practical than her husband, simply said, "You must thank him properly, Elsa. This will see Karl through until spring." Elsa nodded, already composing the letter in her mind, but her thoughts extended beyond simple gratitude. Over the months of correspondence, Sergeant Robert Anderson had transformed from an abstract figure, an American occupier, a former enemy, into a real person with thoughts, feelings, and complexities that defied simple categorization. His letters had offered a window into American perspectives on the conflict and its aftermath that challenged her assumptions and expanded her understanding. As October gave way to November, political tensions continued to rise between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. These global developments affected even the small town of Mittenwald, where refugees from Soviet-controlled areas brought stories that created new anxieties. For the Weber family, however, the more immediate concern was economic survival in a shattered economy. Werner Weber had secured additional translation work through American occupation authorities, providing modest but crucial income. Elsa had found part-time employment as a clerk in the local administration office, where her organized nature and attention to detail were valued. These small improvements in their circumstances coincided with the general stabilization efforts under the Marshall Plan, though daily life remained challenging for most Germans. In Berlin, Sergeant Robert Anderson found himself in the center of escalating Cold War tensions. His engineering background proved valuable in reconstruction efforts, and his duties expanded to include liaison work with German civilian contractors rebuilding critical infrastructure. The city, divided among 4 occupation powers, functioned as a microcosm of the larger geopolitical standoff. Despite his increased responsibilities, Anderson maintained his correspondence with Elsa Weber. His letters now included observations about Berlin, the stark differences between sectors, the emerging political divisions, the resilience of Berliners rebuilding their lives amidst the rubble. He found himself looking forward to Elsa's responses, which offered thoughtful reflections on Germany's evolving situation and occasionally included small details about her family's daily life that humanized the abstract concept of the German people in ways his military briefings never could. In December, a particularly heavy snowfall blanketed Mittenwald, transforming the alpine town into a scene from a fairy tale. The beauty contrasted sharply with the continued hardships, limited fuel for heating, food shortages, and the emotional weight of the first Christmas season since the war's end. For many Germans, including the Webers, the holiday highlighted absences. Friends and relatives who would never return, traditions that seemed hollow in the aftermath of defeat, certainties that had dissolved in the harsh light of reality. Elsa described this contradictory atmosphere in her letter to Anderson, writing of the town's children making snowmen while their mothers queued for meager rations, of Christmas carols sung in the church where many prayed for missing sons and husbands, of her own family's quiet determination to create some semblance of normalcy for Karl's sake. Anderson received this letter in late December, reading it by lamplight in his sparse quarters near Tempelhof Airport. Elsa's description of Christmas preparations in Mittenwald stirred memories of his own family holidays in Ohio. His mother's cooking, his father's rare displays of warmth, the simple traditions that had defined his childhood. For the first time since his deployment, he felt a sharp pang of homesickness that surprised him with its intensity. He found himself writing a longer response than usual, sharing memories of Christmas in Millfield, describing the mining community's traditions, and relating his own family's circumstances. He mentioned his father's declining health, his mother's worry masked by cheerfulness in her letters, his sister Dorothy's engagement to a local boy who had served in the Pacific. These personal details, offered without his usual reserve, marked a shift in their correspondence. The letter concluded with an unprecedented proposal. If circumstances permit, I may have leave in February. Perhaps I could visit Mittenwald briefly. I would like to meet your family in person, especially Karl, and see for myself how he is faring with the medication. Of course, I understand if such a visit would be unwelcome or uncomfortable for your family, given the history between our countries. Please be assured that I will take no offense if you prefer to maintain our correspondence as it is. When Elsa received this letter in early January 1947, she read this final paragraph several times, unsure how to respond. The prospect of meeting Sergeant Anderson in person, transforming him from a correspondent to a physical presence in her family's life, raised complex questions. What would her neighbors think of an American soldier visiting their home? How would Anderson react to the reality of their modest circumstances? Most importantly, how would she herself feel, coming face to face with someone who had become an important figure in her life through words alone? She shared Anderson's letter with her parents that evening after Karl had gone to bed. Werner Weber read it carefully, his expression thoughtful. Margaret watched her husband, waiting for his reaction before offering her own opinion. He seems sincere, Werner finally said, returning the letter to Elsa, and we do owe him gratitude for his help with Karl's medicine. Margarete nodded in agreement. It would be proper to receive him if he makes the journey. He has shown kindness to our family when he had no obligation to do so. The discussion continued as they considered practical matters, where Anderson would stay, as their small home had no guest room, what they could offer as hospitality given their limited resources, how they would explain his visit to curious neighbors. Throughout the conversation, Elsa remained quiet, her own feelings a complex mixture of anticipation and apprehension. That night, she drafted her response carefully. My family would be honored to receive your visit. Karl especially is excited to meet the American who has helped him breathe more easily. Our home is modest, and we cannot offer much in the way of comfort or entertainment, but you would be welcome to take a meal with us and perhaps see something of our town. Please let us know when you might arrive so we can make what preparations we can. As January progressed, Elsa found herself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of Anderson's visit. She scrutinized their home through the imagined eyes of an American, noting the worn furniture, the patched curtains, the evidence of making do with limited resources. She practiced her spoken English, which was less confident than her written command of the language, rehearsing potential conversations during her walks to and from work. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Anderson faced an unexpected complication. Rising tensions between Western and Soviet authorities had led to new restrictions on military personnel travel. Leave was being curtailed, and permission for travel to southern Germany would require special approval. Determined to keep his word, Anderson navigated military bureaucracy, leveraging his good standing with his commanding officer and emphasizing the goodwill value of such visits in the broader context of German-American relations. His persistence paid off in late January, when he received authorization for a 3-day leave in mid-February. He immediately wrote to Elsa, confirming his visit, providing the expected date and time of his arrival in Mittenwald. The letter included a postscript mentioning that he would bring additional medication for Karl and some hard-to-obtain items that might be useful to the family. The Webers received this confirmation with mixed emotions. Werner maintained his reserved manner, but agreed to take time away from his tutoring to be present when Andersen arrived. Margaret began planning what food they could prepare, determining to offer proper hospitality despite rationing. Karl, now 9 years old, asked endless questions about the American sergeant, constructing an increasingly elaborate image of Andersen based on minimal information. Elsa found herself caught between excitement and anxiety as the date approached. The correspondence with Andersen had become significant to her, a connection to a wider world beyond the limitations of post-war Germany. His letters offered perspectives she would otherwise never have encountered, challenging her to reconsider assumptions and expand her understanding. Yet she worried that meeting in person might somehow disrupt the rapport they had developed through writing. What if the real Andersen did not match the person she had come to know through his letters? What if she disappointed him? February 14, 1947, a cold, clear day in Mittenwald. The Weber family had risen early, making final preparations for their American visitor. Werner had polished his one good pair of shoes, Margaret had prepared a modest but carefully planned meal, and Karl had been scrubbed to an unusual state of cleanliness despite his protests. Elsa had changed her outfit 3 times before settling on her best dress, preserved from before the war, and carefully maintained. The appointed time for Andersen's arrival came and went with no sign of the American sergeant. 1 hour passed, then 2. The carefully prepared food cooled on the stove. Karl's initial excitement gave way to disappointment, and Werner began to suggest that perhaps the sergeant had been delayed or had changed his mind. Just as the family was reconciling themselves to disappointment, a knock came at the door. Elsa opened it to find not Sergeant Andersen, but another American soldier, a corporal whose name badge identified him as Miller. For a confused moment, she wondered if this might be the original recipient of her misaddressed letter from nearly a year earlier. The corporal removed his hat, his expression serious. "Miss Weber? I'm looking for the Weber family. I have a message from Sergeant Andersen." Elsa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February air. "Yes, I am Elsa Weber. Please come in." The soldier stepped inside, nodding respectfully to Werner and Margaret, who had moved to stand behind their daughter. He held an envelope in his gloved hands. "Sergeant Andersen asked me to deliver this to you personally and to express his sincere regrets. There was an incident last night at a checkpoint. He was injured while responding to it." Margaret gasped softly, her hand moving to her heart. "How badly?" "He's stable, Ma'am. Took some shrapnel to his leg. He's being treated at the military hospital in Berlin. He was very insistent that you be informed personally, not just by letter. Said you were expecting him today." The corporal handed the envelope to Elsa. "He dictated this from his hospital bed, wanted to make sure you got it today." Elsa opened the envelope with trembling fingers, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was not Andersen's familiar neat script, but someone else's hasty scrawl, clearly written under dictation. The letter was brief, explaining that he had been involved in an incident at a checkpoint between the American and Soviet sectors. He apologized profusely for missing their meeting and promised to write again when his condition improved. The letter concluded with a request that seemed to have been added as an afterthought. "Please tell Karl I'm sorry to disappoint him. The package I brought for him is with Corporal Miller." Elsa looked up from the letter to find the corporal holding out a brown paper parcel tied with string. Sergeant Andersen was carrying this. "He was very clear that it should be delivered to you today regardless of circumstances." Werner stepped forward to accept the package, thanking the corporal with formal courtesy. "Please convey our wishes for Sergeant Andersen's swift recovery. We are sorry to hear of his misfortune and grateful for his thoughtfulness, despite his condition." After declining their offer of refreshment, Corporal Miller departed, leaving the Weber family to process this unexpected turn of events. Karl was the first to break the silence, asking if they could open the package. Werner carefully untied the string and unwrapped the brown paper to reveal several items: the promised medication for Karl, coffee and sugar for the family, a bar of chocolate, and a small, carefully wrapped book, an English-German dictionary with a handwritten note from Anderson on the flyleaf. To assist in our correspondence and perhaps your future career as a translator. With respect and friendship, Robert Anderson. The thoughtfulness of these gifts, selected and transported across hundreds of kilometers by a man they had never met, left the Weber family deeply moved. Even Werner, usually reserved in his emotions, appeared affected by this tangible evidence of kindness from a former enemy. For Elsa, the moment crystallized something that had been gradually forming through months of correspondence. The realization that healing, personal, familial, perhaps even national, might be possible through individual connections that transcended the artificial barriers of politics and propaganda. The dictionary in particular touched her deeply, representing as it did Anderson's recognition and support of her aspirations. That evening, after a subdued family meal featuring the food they had prepared for their expected guest, Elsa composed a letter to Anderson at the Berlin military hospital. She expressed concern for his injuries, gratitude for the gifts, and encouragement for his recovery. She included a small drawing Karl had made for him, a childish but heartfelt depiction of Mittenwald's church spire against mountain backdrop, with the words, "Get well," carefully printed at the bottom in English. "We still hope to welcome you to Mittenwald when your health permits," she wrote in closing. "Until then, please know that you have friends here who are thinking of you and wishing for your recovery." In the Berlin military hospital, Staff Sergeant Robert Anderson lay in a narrow bed, his bandaged leg elevated on pillows. The ward around him bustled with activity, nurses checking patients, orderlies changing linens, doctors making rounds. The injury was not life-threatening but significant enough to require several weeks of recovery before he could return to limited duty. Anderson had been frustrated and disappointed about missing his planned visit to Mittenwald, but Corporal Miller's return with confirmation of the package's delivery had somewhat eased his regret. Now, a week later, receiving Elsa's letter and Karl's drawing brought an unexpected brightness to the sterile hospital environment. His roommate, Lieutenant James Harrington, noticed Anderson's improved mood as he read the letter. "Good news from home, Sergeant?" Anderson shook his head. "Not from home. Remember that German family I mentioned? The one I've been corresponding with after a mix-up with a letter." The girl sent a reply and a drawing from her little brother. Harrington raised an eyebrow. "You're mighty invested in this German family, Anderson. Any particular reason?" The question gave Anderson pause. Why had he maintained this correspondence, gradually increasing its personal nature over time? Why had he gone to such lengths to arrange a visit, navigating military bureaucracy and traveling across occupation zones? The connection had begun accidentally, but had developed into something meaningful, something that challenged his previous understanding of former enemies. "They're just people," he finally replied. "Regular people trying to rebuild their lives. The girl's smart, wants to be a translator. The kid has asthma. The father was a professor before the war. They're not what we were told Germans were like." Harrington nodded slowly. "Had a similar experience myself. Was billeted with a family in Frankfurt for a while. Father was a doctor who'd lost his practice because he wouldn't join the party. Got to talking with him about baseball, of all things. Turns out he'd visited America in the 20s, seen Babe Ruth play. Found myself staying up late, discussing everything from medical practices to jazz music. Made me think about how things might have been different if people like him had been in charge instead of, well, you know." This conversation marked the beginning of Anderson's realization that his experience with the Weber family was not unique. Throughout the hospital, similar stories emerged as he spoke with other recovering soldiers. Tales of unexpected connections formed across the divide of recent conflict, of discoveries that humanized those who had so recently been enemies. Major William Thompson, a career military officer who had served in both world wars, offered particular insight during a conversation in the hospital recreation room. "What you're discovering, Anderson, isn't new. It happens after every conflict. The politicians and generals create divisions, but soldiers on the ground eventually see the humanity on both sides. It's been happening since men first picked up weapons against each other. Anderson considered this historical perspective. But this war was different, wasn't it, sir? After what we saw in the camps. The Major's expression grew somber. Yes and no. The scale and methodology were unprecedented, certainly. But the basic mechanism, convincing ordinary people that another group isn't fully human, that's as old as warfare itself. What's important now is rebuilding connections, helping the good people on both sides recognize each other again. These conversations during Anderson's recovery period provided a framework for understanding his evolving relationship with the Weber family. His correspondence with Elsa continued throughout February and March, gaining depth and nuance as both participants became more comfortable sharing personal reflections. In Mittenwald, Elsa's regular letters to the American sergeant had not gone unnoticed. Her closest friend, Brigitte Hoffmann, expressed concern about the potential for gossip. "People are talking, Elsa. They say you're too friendly with the Americans." Elsa bristled at the implication. "I write letters to one American who has helped my family and shown kindness when he had no reason to do so. What exactly are people suggesting?" Brigitte's expression softened. "Nothing terrible, just that it's unusual, that perhaps you're being naive. Some of the older generation still sees the Americans as occupiers, not friends." This conversation highlighted the complex social position Elsa navigated. Many Germans her age were eager to embrace new connections with Allied personnel, seeing opportunities for broader horizons after years of isolation. Others, particularly those who had most deeply invested in the previous regime's worldview, maintained suspicion and resentment toward the occupying forces. Elsa found herself increasingly identifying with the forward-looking perspective, partly through her correspondence with Anderson. His letters offered glimpses of American life, culture, and values that contradicted the caricatures she had been raised with. More importantly, they suggested possibilities for her own future that extended beyond the limited options visible in post-war Germany. By early April, Anderson had recovered sufficiently to return to light duties in Berlin. His correspondence with Elsa continued, now including discussions of the escalating tensions between Western and Soviet authorities that dominated daily life in the divided city. The Berlin blockade was still more than a year away, but the groundwork was being laid in increasingly hostile interactions between occupation forces. During this period, Anderson's role shifted to include more direct work with German civilians as part of reconstruction efforts. His experiences with the Weber family, particularly his correspondence with Elsa, had given him insights and sensitivity that proved valuable in these interactions. Where some American personnel maintained distance from the German population, Anderson actively engaged, listening to concerns and working to address practical problems. His commanding officer, Major Lawrence Simmons, noted this approach during a performance review. "You've developed good rapport with the locals. Anderson, better than most, makes our job easier when they see us as partners in rebuilding rather than just occupiers." Anderson attributed this ability directly to his ongoing correspondence with Elsa. "I've been writing to a German family for nearly a year now, sir. Gives me a different perspective on how things look from their side." The Major seemed intrigued rather than concerned. This kind of grassroots diplomacy can be more effective than official policies. If more of our people and more Germans made these connections, reconciliation might happen faster. This conversation planted a seed in Anderson's thinking, one that would eventually grow into something much larger than his individual correspondence with Elsa Weber. But first, there was the matter of his postponed visit to Mittenwald. In May 1947, almost exactly a year after Elsa's misdirected letter had first reached him, Anderson finally received permission for a week's leave and the necessary travel documents to visit southern Germany. He wrote to inform the Weber family of his plans, careful to give them ample notice and the opportunity to reconsider their invitation. Elsa's reply came quickly, confirming that they would be delighted to receive his visit and suggesting local accommodations since their home had no space for guests. Her letter conveyed an enthusiasm that suggested the entire family, not just Elsa herself, looked forward to meeting the American sergeant who had become part of their lives through correspondence. On May 20th, Anderson boarded a military transport train in Berlin, beginning the journey south through a Germany still bearing the visible scars of conflict. As the landscape outside the window gradually transformed from the northern plains to the foothills of the Alps, he found himself increasingly anxious about the upcoming meeting. What if the family disappointed him? Worse, what if he disappointed them? A year of correspondence had created expectations on both sides, but face-to-face interactions followed different rules than the measured exchange of letters. The train reached Munich the following day, where Andersen transferred to a local service that would take him the final distance to Mittenwald. The small locomotive wound through increasingly spectacular mountain scenery, a beauty that contrasted sharply with the evident poverty in the villages they passed. Germany's economic recovery was beginning, but rural areas like this still struggled with basic necessities. Mittenwald station was little more than a platform with a small building, surrounded by mountains that seemed to touch the sky. As Andersen stepped off the train, military duffel bag slung over his shoulder, he immediately spotted Elsa waiting on the platform. She was exactly as she had described herself, average height, blonde hair pulled back from her face, wearing a blue dress that had clearly been carefully maintained for important occasions. Their first meeting was awkward, formal handshakes and careful pleasantries in a mixture of English and German. Karl broke the tension by asking directly if Andersen's leg still hurt, pointing to where he knew the injury had been. The simple, childish concern made Andersen laugh, releasing the nervousness that had built during the journey. "No, it doesn't hurt anymore, Karl. The doctors fixed it very well." He knelt to the boy's level, reaching into his pocket. "I brought something for you. Your sister mentioned you liked to draw." He produced a set of colored pencils, unavailable in local shops due to ongoing shortages. Karl's face lit up as he accepted the gift, examining each color with wonder, before his mother reminded him to express thanks. The interaction set the tone for the visit, genuine warmth gradually overcoming initial reserve. The Weber home was exactly as Elsa had described in her letters, modest but meticulously maintained, bearing the subtle signs of previously better circumstances. Family photographs on the walls showed their former life in Munich, Werner in academic regalia, Margarete younger and more carefree, Elsa and Karl as small children in front of a substantial home that had since been destroyed in the bombing. Werner Weber greeted Andersen with formal courtesy that gradually warmed as they discovered shared interests in mathematics and engineering. By evening, the initial awkwardness had largely dissipated, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of people genuinely interested in learning about each other's lives and perspectives. Over the next 3 days, Andersen was given a thorough tour of Mittenwald and its surroundings. Elsa proved a knowledgeable guide, explaining the town's history as a center for violin making, and pointing out architectural features that predated the modern era by centuries. Karl enthusiastically showed off his school and favorite places to play, while Werner arranged for Andersen to meet other local residents, including veterans who had served on the Eastern Front. These conversations, conducted with Elsa translating when necessary, provided Andersen with insights into the German experience of the war that differed significantly from official American narratives. He heard of initial enthusiasm giving way to disillusionment, of growing awareness of atrocities that could not be acknowledged openly, of the terrible conditions on the Russian front where so many had perished, and of the complicated mix of relief and humiliation that accompanied defeat. One evening, sitting in the small garden behind the Weber home, Andersen found himself in a particularly meaningful conversation with Werner. The older man spoke with unusual candor about his own journey from conditional support of the regime to private horror, as its true nature became apparent. "The great shame for many of us," Werner said quietly, "is not what we did but what we failed to do. We saw small injustices and remained silent, telling ourselves they were anomalies or necessities. By the time the larger horrors became clear, speaking out meant death not just for oneself but for one's family." Andersen nodded, understanding the impossible choices civilians had faced. "My father fought in the First World War. He always told me the real victims in any conflict are the ordinary people caught between powerful forces they can't control." Werner considered this. There is truth in that, but it does not absolve us of responsibility. To rebuild our country properly, we must acknowledge what went wrong, not just militarily but morally. This conversation stayed with Anderson long after the visit concluded. On his final evening in Mittenwald, the Webers hosted a small gathering, inviting neighbors and friends to meet their American guest. The atmosphere was initially reserved, but warmed considerably as the evening progressed. Anderson found himself engaged in conversations about everything from American jazz music to German literature, from baseball to the mountain traditions of Bavaria. Elsa watched these interactions with quiet satisfaction. Seeing Anderson in person, interacting with her family and community, had transformed him from an abstraction, my American correspondent, into a fully realized individual with quirks, strengths, and flaws. His genuine interest in German culture and willingness to listen without judgment had impressed her family and neighbors, challenging their preconceptions, just as his letters had challenged hers. As the gathering dispersed and Anderson prepared to return to his local lodgings for the last night, Elsa walked with him partway, enjoying the clear, star-filled mountain sky. Their conversation, conducted in a mixture of English and German, reflected on the success of the visit. "Your family has been incredibly welcoming," Anderson said. "I never expected to feel so comfortable in a German home, especially after everything that's happened between our countries." Elsa nodded. "I think my father particularly has enjoyed your discussions. He misses intellectual conversation. Many of his former colleagues are gone, dead, imprisoned, or fled to other countries." Anderson considered this before responding. "You know, there are programs starting for German academics to visit American universities. Exchange programs to rebuild international scholarly connections. Perhaps your father might be interested when they become more widely available." This casual suggestion would eventually lead to Werner Weber receiving a visiting position at Ohio State University in 1949, the first step in rebuilding his academic career. But on that May evening in 1947, it was simply one of many possibilities being discussed as two young people from recently opposing nations found common ground under a shared sky. The following morning, the entire Weber family accompanied Anderson to the train station. Farewells were more emotional than any of them had anticipated after just a few days' acquaintance. Karl clung to Anderson's hand, extracting a promise of more letters and another visit. Werner and Margaret expressed sincere gratitude for his friendship with their family. Elsa, maintaining her composure with visible effort, thanked him for making the journey despite the earlier complications. As the train pulled away from the station, Anderson felt a curious sense of leaving something valuable behind. The visit had affected him more deeply than he had expected, transforming abstract concepts like reconciliation and rebuilding into personal, emotional realities. The Weber family, Werner with his quiet dignity, Margarete with her practical kindness, Karl with his childish enthusiasm, and Elsa with her thoughtful intelligence, had become more than just recipients of his letters. They had become friends, connections that transcended national boundaries and historical divisions. Upon returning to Berlin, Anderson found himself discussing the visit with fellow officers, describing the Weber family and the insights he had gained. Major Simmons listened with particular interest, eventually making a suggestion that would have far-reaching consequences. "Sounds like a valuable cultural exchange, Anderson. The kind of thing we should be encouraging on a larger scale. Why not write it up as a report? Might give the higher-ups some ideas about fostering more of these connections." Anderson's report, submitted in June 1947, detailed his correspondence with the Weber family, his visit to Mittenwald, and the mutual understanding that had developed through these interactions. He emphasized the potential benefits of encouraging similar connections between American personnel and German civilians, particularly families with no strong ties to the former regime. What Anderson could not have anticipated was that his report would be read by Brigadier General Robert McKinnon, who had been tasked with developing programs to improve German-American relations. McKinnon saw in Anderson's experience a model that could be replicated on a larger scale. In late June, Anderson was summoned to division headquarters, where General McKinnon proposed an unexpected assignment. "We're establishing a new cultural exchange initiative, Sergeant. Your experience with this German family suggests you have the right temperament and approach for the work. We'd like you to help develop and implement the program. The Bridge Builders Program, as it would eventually be known, began modestly in August 1947. American military personnel were encouraged to establish correspondence with German families, particularly those with children or young adults. The program provided guidelines, translation assistance, and occasional opportunities for in-person meetings. Anderson, promoted to technical sergeant for this assignment, worked alongside German and American educators to structure the initiative. Elsa Weber became one of the program's first German coordinators, helping to match letter writers and providing guidance to German participants. Her experience with Anderson made her ideally suited to explain the potential benefits and navigate potential misunderstandings. Her role eventually expanded to include interpretation at official events and assistance with documentation. By early 1948, the program had expanded beyond Berlin to include American zones throughout Germany. Over 1,000 American personnel and German families had established regular correspondence, with hundreds of in-person visits completed. Participants reported significant improvements in mutual understanding and respect, with many developing friendships that would last for decades. The program gained additional significance during the Berlin airlift, when American aircraft delivered supplies to the blockaded western sectors of the city. Many German families involved in bridge builders helped coordinate distribution of these supplies, while their American correspondents provided personal packages for children and families experiencing hardship. Werner Weber, whose improved English and American connections through Anderson had led to translation work for occupation authorities, became a valuable liaison between German civilians and American officials during this crisis. His wartime experience managing scarce resources proved unexpectedly useful in the new context of ensuring equitable distribution of limited supplies. For the Weber family personally, the connection with Robert Anderson led to opportunities that would have been unimaginable before their correspondence began. Werner's eventual academic position in Ohio opened doors not just for himself, but for his family. Karl received specialized medical treatment for his asthma at American facilities, eventually studying medicine himself. Margaret developed a cultural exchange program for German and American homemakers, sharing recipes and household management techniques adapted to post-war scarcity. Elsa's path was perhaps the most directly influenced by the correspondence that had begun with a misdirected letter. Her role in the Bridge Builders program led to a position with the emerging diplomatic services, where her translation skills and cultural sensitivity were highly valued. By 1950, she had secured a scholarship to study international relations at Columbia University in New York, the first step in what would become a distinguished career in diplomacy. Robert Anderson's own life took unexpected turns following the establishment of Bridge Builders. Rather than returning to Ohio and the mining community he had once been eager to escape, he accepted a commission as an officer focused on civilian-military relations. His engineering background, combined with his demonstrated ability to work effectively with German counterparts, made him valuable in reconstruction efforts that increasingly involved German and American collaboration. The most remarkable aspect of the program's success was how it grew from a simple misaddressed letter to a framework for reconciliation that touched thousands of lives. By 1955, the Bridge Builders model had been adapted for use in Japan and was being considered for implementation in South Korea as well. Educational exchanges, cultural programs, and even business partnerships had grown from connections initially fostered through the simple exchange of letters. On May 15, 1956, exactly 10 years after Elsa Weber had first written her misaddressed thank you note, a reunion was held in Berlin for original participants in what had become one of the most successful grassroots reconciliation programs of the post-war era. Over 300 former letter writers, both American and German, gathered to celebrate their individual connections and the broader impact of the initiative. The highlight of the event was a speech delivered jointly by Elsa Weber, now a junior diplomat with the West German Foreign Service, and Robert Anderson, who had left military service to work with international student exchange programs. They recounted the story of their accidental correspondence and the friendship that had developed from it, emphasizing how individual connections could transcend national divisions and historical animosities. 10 years ago, Elsa told the assembled guests, I made a simple mistake in copying an address. That error led to a correspondence that changed not only my life, but the lives of thousands of others through the program it inspired. It shows how the smallest actions can have consequences we never imagine. Anderson continued. What began as a simple correction of a misaddressed letter became a friendship that challenged everything I thought I knew about former enemies. That friendship expanded into a program that has built bridges between our nations. One letter, one visit, one personal connection at a time. The success of Bridge Builders had ripple effects that extended far beyond the program itself. Participants who had formed connections through correspondence often maintained those relationships independently after returning to civilian life. American veterans introduced their German friends to business associates, leading to commercial partnerships that contributed to West Germany's economic revival. German families hosted American students, creating educational opportunities that broadened international understanding. Children who had grown up exchanging letters with their counterparts across the Atlantic developed into adults with global perspectives that influenced their professional and personal choices. For Elsa Weber and Robert Anderson, the correspondence that began by accident developed into a lifelong friendship that transcended geographical distance and cultural differences. Though their career paths took them in different directions, they maintained regular communication and occasional visits, serving as informal ambassadors for the program they had inspired. The story of their correspondence became something of a legend within diplomatic circles, often cited as an example of how personal connections could lay groundwork for official relations. When formal treaties were signed between the Federal Republic of Germany and the United States in later decades, few knew that some of the foundational trust that made such agreements possible had roots in a misdirected letter and the relationship it had spawned. Karl Weber, whose childhood asthma had been the original reason for Elsa's thank you note, grew into a physician specializing in respiratory conditions. His practice in Munich eventually included a charity program providing treatment for children from families with limited resources, inspired by the memory of an American soldier who had once secured medicine for a German boy he had never met. Werner and Margaret Weber, in their later years, often reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed from that day in May 1946, when Elsa had sent her letter to the wrong address. From the depths of post-war deprivation to renewed academic respect and improved circumstances, their journey had been shaped by connections that began with that simple correspondence. The broader legacy of the Bridge Builders program extended into the 21st century, with descendant programs still operating in various forms. Participants' children and grandchildren sometimes continued connections between families, creating international relationships spanning generations. The program became a case study in effective reconciliation techniques, studied by diplomats and peacekeepers working in other regions emerging from conflict. The story of Elsa Weber's misaddressed letter serves as a reminder of how individual actions, even mistakes, can sometimes lead to outcomes of unexpected significance. What began as a simple expression of gratitude became the foundation for a program that helped rebuild trust between former enemies, created opportunities for thousands of participants, and contributed to the healing of wartime wounds through personal connections rather than political proclamations. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.